This is a meeting taking place on September 4th in Luc Tuymans' studio in Antwerp and in preparation for a new conference format, Disputaziuns Susch. Starting this coming autumn, we are about to gather artists and scholars in the remote Alpine region of Engadin in Switzerland. And for this first Disputaziuns, we are going to discuss Reformation and Counter-Reformation, images of power and the power of images. And since sadly you can't be with us, Luc, on this occasion, we took the chance of meeting you here today to start a conversation, and along painterly to political questions, we shall find our way through history's past to arrive in the very present.
In my case, where I come from, in terms of roots, so to speak, also visual roots, the most empowering structure was a structure before the Reformation, and especially also mostly in one entity of one person, which is actually Jan van Eyck, who in a sense, although working under the sort of like framework and under the religious dogma, which that by then encompassed every part of knowledge, science, everything, was enabled to, by heightening the realism into his imagery, he was enabled to, in fact, propel the imagery outside of the frame and sort of like disconnected it from the mimetic imagery of Christianism. If you see Granach and Van Eyck, you see two different perceptions of the real. There is, in Granach, clearly an emphasis upon the figure itself, basically. The figure as an entity, the figure as an individual within the framework. And there is a clear characterization of the figure in terms of how it emotively runs through the imagery, in terms of what the vice could be. There is a clear, a much more moralistic element that plays out with Granach in terms of the reinstatement of the individual and its position in the world, which is totally different with Van Eyck, which is probably, I mean, it's a bit before Granach also in a sense. Whereas Van Eyck goes into a sort of realism that is actually going through the bone, in a sense, because every detail, every person, everything in the framework of the image is sort of like developed with the same attention and with the same, to a point, nearly morbid sort of indifference to a point. We are now in a city here, and we're also a year away from a show that I'm going to do about the Baroque, which of course will, in the other part of the city, emphasize upon the figure of Rubens, which is, of course, a very exponential figure within the Counter-Reformation. Rubens came at the very eminent moment and started to recreate and started to like reinsert this imagery, an imagery that is made out of distance, an imagery that works with the idea of animation, in a sense, an imagery that also is not psychological, but mostly mythological, and a mythological element that is being and has been used, and this also goes back to the Jesuit structure, of course, to sort of like enlarge and at the same time to overpower. There is an element of shock and awe in the element of decision-making and how to persuade large peoples in terms of a conversion to a certain belief structure. A belief structure that also had an economical purpose, in a sense. Because, as I said, it's a very globalized structure, and it was also a structure of power, and it was also in accordance to the papacy in terms of relinquishing that power, keeping that power together, and actually, which was at that point slightly startled because of the whole situation. Of course, there's been bloody wars because of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, and there's been a geographical cut. The weird thing, if you compare the North with the South, or the South with the North, so to speak, that is that, as I already implicated, the idea of Rubens was a structure which was first of all, I think Rubens painted the biggest paintings at that point in time. So he could be perceived as the first Cecil B. DeMille, in a sense. And in a sense, this sort of filmic, cinematographical image of, as I told you, the concentric eye, developing an image from within a studio and then letting it be developed by not only him, but also his collaborators, is much more the element of the teamwork than the isolated image. And the images were not made clearly for a private consumption. They were made for a massive consumption, which means churches and distance. And this is in stark contrast with what happened in the Golden Age in Holland, so to speak, where the image is being reduced to a point. Either the singularity of the person who is portrayed, and it much more goes into a civilian society and the portrayal of that, from Vermeer and his sort of like stilled atmosphere, also using the camera obscura, which is already a device in between, not unsimilar to what, but it's a device then used to sort of like freeze the imagery in a sense, and creates an atmospheric image. Whereas Rembrandt goes into the psychology of the portrait. The main characterization is the element of how you assess power. And within Catholicism, this idea of assessing power was a different form of statement. As I already said, it was the element of overpowering, but it was also the element of being elusive. And the element of deception is far bigger within that framework of the imagery than in the other one. Because I think it's relevant at the moment we live in. I mean, if we talk about the idea of not only a virtual reality, but even yet to a point now of fake news and fake propositions, lies that have become sort of like predestined within its own self, sort of like self-prophecy that sort of builds up a reality which goes deeper than the reality that we actually can perceive. And I think from that point of view, the whole situation of what the Jesuits did in terms of an empowering power structure, visual, but not only that, but also with music, and also with the way they deduced knowledge, I think, which was a deduction of knowledge which was not totally straightforward. It was a deduction that was adaptable, flexible, and a deduction of power, and a belief structure that was close to power. I made a show in 1999 which was called The Passion, and which was about me remembering a visit with my parents in the 70s in Oberammergau. When I made that show, I could not really, I could have never have thought that religion would play out as it played out later on. At that point, I saw it as a cosmetic element and treated it as such because having worked from the brochures of this particular Passion play, which takes 7 hours, in which the villagers still play Christ and so on and so on, and either rather treated it like that, but as a slight premonition, even a couple of years later, this whole structure became more and more imminent and more powerful and important. So the underlying structures of a belief structure seem to be very purposeful and very difficult to deal with, in a sense. But I also have to say that probably a lot of these propositions are also highly depending upon geopolitics, in a sense. And of course, there is the element of terrorism, which has been played out, which is partially a fabrication to a point, but a fabrication with a certain purpose in terms of rule and divide. And all these elements have sort of led to a persistent idea of insecurity, which is yet again part of the power structure to divide and rule in order to sort of like control a situation. That control has gone much further with the sort of like naive belief that the internet would open up the world to people, but of course it's controlled by individuals, by groups, by corporations, even to a point that in the terms of how the last elections played out, the ones Obama already used social media, Trump used it even more, and the interference by the Russians through nearly a sort of like cyber attack like situation or an information war within the framework of that internet. And that, of course, then turned into social media, changed the perception of the world. But that perception or that change in perception, if you would compare that with the belief structure, becomes quite interesting, but because it becomes interesting within the idea of how its own vulnerability is not only passed on, perceived, but also tried to persuade people to sort of make a choice. Yet now again, it's the element of reduction which becomes important in terms of choice and the matter of choice, in terms that since there is not only an overflow, but there's also the grave danger that you would sort of close yourself into a bubble within the sort of like modern means that are there, and the idea how you sort of assert and sort of like not only explore, but also assemble the idea of knowledge, which is on the one hand so-called virulent and all the time there, but not really. So the element of being analytical becomes much more important. The idea of being critical about the idea of how knowledge is not only perceived but transferred is an imminent danger, and therefore important to sort of like question continuously. My work as a painter, which is a medium which is worked and with time, through time, over time. And it's also an image that is traditionally extremely loaded, especially when it comes even to belief structures or even to what we are just talking about, or this entire history of how it can induce or it can actually sort of like develop an element of being critical or not critical. What is more important is that the work that I sort of like propose to the world should be a work that should be distrusted. It should be based upon this element of not only questioning, but a sort of really embedded distrust towards imagery. Words work on your memory, but make different associations as images. This is the interesting thing if we talk about Reformation and Counter-Reformation, for example. In the idea of the Reformation, the works were more strict. The scripture was important. It was important to make an interpretation of it on an individual level, but nevertheless, it was the basic element. Whereas the scripture in the Counter-Reformation becomes much more deleted and delusional within how the interpretations could be made, because they were also immediately transported into a visual. A different assessment of a reality that is on the one hand an illusion, because the illusion is partially the imagery as a proposition, as an aversion to the strictness of the scripture. I think those were the two, and it's not that they worked as a subtitle, you know, they really differed. They differed in order of what the power propositions were. So the idea of Western image building is an idea that largely comes out of this idea of Counter-Reformation. Those things now, the day and age we live, it's also a different form of consumption in a sense. How you consume actually not only knowledge, but the idea of an image or the word. How you sort of like put that into self-reference with the individual itself. So there is within the idea of Protestantism, I think, on the one hand, a very large moral, sort of ethical code But there is also a sort of stressing, which was already the revolution at the time when it came about, on the individual's perception and the individual's interpretation, which means that God was not something that you, or the idea of, let's say, heaven was not something that far away. It was much closer to the individual, and the idea to better themselves on earth was something as a proposition, whereas the other one was a postponed situation. The idea of flesh vice, and there is also a clear pornographic element, which is now fairly well embedded in society. Every new technology diverts to an element of pornography, to a sense. And the biggest pornographers are actually individuals right now who not only use pornography, but are actually in the midst of creating it through technical devices. In a sense, this is the element of, again, postponing situation. This is the element that is the closest to the animalistic perception of how you deal with your experience. Most of the works deal with that inadvertently. They deal, as I said, with this element of genuine distrust, even against the imagery I make. Memory is always inadequate. The fact that I use tonality is because of this impact on the brain. So, in a sense, it's a bit similar to the deep web, to a point, because it works as such, but with a different modus, something much more archaic, which is painting. I very clearly understood from the very beginning that painting straightforwardly was not the option, because man needs an element of detachment in order to come to a visual. That's an interesting point also, which is not really discussed within this Reformation and counter-Reformation situation. This is exactly the language in between the imagery and the word that I'm talking about. And this has, of course, purposely been misused and therefore could be abused because of the sort of twilight zone in which it actually propels itself. And it's open for a great deal of interpretation, in a sense. And this sort of plausibility of working from an image towards a content or a signifier are things that till this day, and that's why images still exist and behold a certain element of not a magical power, but a power that is sort of like enabled to silence people, for example, even if it's for seconds. That is the sort of the ultimate lapse in time, which is important. Photography is in the moment. Filming and painting are two elements where you approach the imagery. So it's much more the approach than the taking of the imagery. So there is a similarity in both processes. That's why also, for me, Rubens is clearly nearly one of the very first filmmakers, because of this assessment of not only the composition, the diagonals, the red, the dynamics, but especially the idea that around this concentric view, which is a circular view, which is already amplifying the idea of a lens, or something through which you get a telescopic vision, actually, of a reality around which everything turns, is, and less singular, because there was the element of creating a whole much more than creating singularities, which is something Rembrandt did imminently, especially when it goes to the late Rembrandt, where the self-depiction becomes a fairly existential, but also, apart from that existential depiction, a sort of icon of that sort of self-immanent, not in terms of predestination or in a fatalistic point, but in a sort nearly an element of heroism to withstand things. And if you turn that into a more romanticized context, then that, of course, becomes still something else. That's where the heroic element takes in, and how an individual puts a stand against the rest, so to speak. For me, in terms of portraits, or when portraiture arises in my work, it has a very iconic element to it, and secondly, it is mostly a shell. I try to devoid it of any sort of psychology in a sense, and therefore they become very the psychology is actually heightened to a point. So it has the sort of very strange fascination for me that they have to reverberate in the sense that they disconnect, and to a high level they are symptomatic in a sense also. But they all of sort hide something in a way. The main issue is not so much, as I said, who the person is and what kind of empathy I would have for the person. No, this is the other way around, actually. It is much more the distance idea. It is nearly an object-like perception of a person in a way. That's why I came up with Jan van Eyck in the beginning, because Jan van Eyck was very unforgiving in his depiction of people. They became very real. But at the same time, because of the fact that they became very real, they were totally unearthed. So they become sort of like, they persist in their imagery. And they could be seen as iconic or not, but they are sort of, you could nearly feel them breathe to a point. But it's not something that I look for in the first place. Mm-hmm. What I look for in the first place is the sort of like, what the imagery, mostly, as I already told, as a shell reverberates. I mean, it's moreover the first instance when you freeze an image, when the image is frozen, when it's like completely immobilized. It is also a clear fascination with death. That as the after image of something. So in a sense, it's an element of something that has departed already. And I think that's the shell-like surface, the doll maker aspect of the portrait, which I find very fascinating because it is mostly in preparation of imagery, I sort of analyze them to death, and it's only through the act of painting that they are sort of revived. Painting is an element that has to do with timing and precision, and therefore also is limited. The painting process is where I actually shift the intelligence from the brain to the hands, which is a different intelligence, the physical one. The imagery is about relevance. And either an image is relevant or it's irrelevant. Now, some images which I had perceived as irrelevant could become relevant much later. So there is, again, this proposition of time within the framework of developing it. If you talk about the idea of the iconic, but also the idea of, how do you call it, the symbolic, the iconic, and then the sort of the things that induce imagery. Those are sort of implications within an image which are constant in a sense. And although imagery, especially in my case, it's immobilized, it's sort of like either frozen, immobilized, taken. It's also sometimes enlarged, which is a sort of filmic reduction of my former experience. But it's always, and even when it's a fragment of totality. I mean, it sort of like works like an ornament in a sense. And that encompassed back into a belief structure is quite interesting too. I mean, so it's very difficult to sort of, because the thing that, what makes art religious or not, I mean, or the spiritual stance to an artwork, how works that, what kind of device is that, for example. There is an element that is, of course you can explain everything, but there is an element which deals with a certain idea of the gap. And that gap, which is to a point an element of void, Yet again, in accordance to a belief structure, there is the uncertainty. Most of the similar attempts in contemporary art, and then the worst one is actually the deep web, because the deep web through algorithms is sort of like mostly used in a negative sense to control the populace again, and to steer them into the way they behave, and their behaviorism is measured in accordance to even the way they vote. So this is a clear denominator of how you, in a very invisible way, could crawl into the privacy of somebody's life and deter it. Now, in a way, the paintings I make have a lot to do with this idea of the deep web, in terms of like inducing and sort of like trying to work on some kind of memory. Hopefully in a more less negative way, but nevertheless working with negativity. This is where the distrust again becomes an important fact, and also partially because within Catholicism and within any form of a belief structure, you are induced with guilt.